In 399 BC, the Greek democracy condemned one of the greatest philosophers to death for spreading bad ideas among the youth. Today, he is considered the father of Western philosophy and possibly the father of Western civilization. His tragic death sparked a new human philosophy that was based on rational thinking, not religious dogma. Who was this man? It was, of course, Mr. Socrates. Well, he lost his life, but rationality triumphed. He paid the price with his own life. It's no surprise or exaggeration to tell you that Western philosophy originated in Greece, mainly in the city of Athens. Previously, I talked about the differences between Eastern and Western philosophies due to different terrains, food production, cultural exchanges, and so on, that gave rise to spiritualism in the East, while rationalism in the West. Eastern philosophy centered on farming and rivers became fatalistic, while the Greeks centered on trade and the seas became rationalistic. So here I'll talk about the three of the most famous forefathers of Western rational philosophy: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Before I talk about the big three, let me mention a few who came before. The first known Greek philosopher was Thales of Miletus, who said that everything is made of water. Today we know that 60% of human body and 70% of our brain are made of water, so he was right. He also used reason to predict how the weather affected olive harvest and made a lot of money as a result. People at the time believed the good or bad harvest was in the hands of gods. So Thales understood that it had nothing to do with it, but just good weather. So Western philosophy from the very earliest time emphasized rationality to understand and manipulate nature to benefit humans. And he was a businessman. Another notable philosopher was Pythagoras, famous for his theorem a squared b squared equals c squared. He argued that the world is run by mathematical rules which can be understood through numbers. Even musical harmony is ruled by geometrical rules. So Pythagoras based his ideas on mathematical logic, which is a step deeper and more rigid than rationality. Another logical philosopher is Parmenides, who also used logical thinking and reasoning to prove that human experience gives us false perception of the world, often contradicts with logical thinking. So early Greek philosophers paved the way for rationality to become the method of thinking. Socrates. If you have to name one person as the founder of Western philosophy, one name stands tall above everybody else. It is, of course, Mr. Socrates, not the football legend from Brazil, but an ancient Greek dude who lived between 469 and 399 BCE. He was the true father of Western philosophy because he developed a robust philosophical method to understand the meaning of life and to expose dogmas. Unlike everyone else, he did not accept things at face value. His questioning or dialectical method of examining everything through a series of questions to get to the bottom of things or finding the truth became the basis of modern scientific method. To understand something, you have to go through a series of questions like what, where, when, why, and how. Once you go through all these questions, the answer you get tends to be the best answer out there. Today's science does the same thing. Scientific theories are tested through a series of experiments. Socrates also questioned the purpose of life itself. For him, the purpose of life was to be virtuous. How can you be virtuous? Again, you have to examine your life critically. You cannot sit in your comfortable chair and live in ignorance. Uncomfortable truths are better than comforting lies. He famously said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." In other words, ignorance wasn't bliss, just stupid and unworthy. This had a massive psychological shift in how people saw the world and themselves. You couldn't just rely on gods or even the priests. You had the ability to rationally question things and get to the truth for yourself. The Athenian democracy saw him as a threat, awakening the youth, so they forced him to sip hemlock poison, which killed him in 399 BC, making him a true martyr of philosophy. Socrates was a street philosopher who walked around the streets of Athens to question people and have a dialogue about life and philosophy. He was like a modern-day provocateur or a whistleblower. The authorities didn't like it. Socrates' philosophical legacy was to make truth the most important aim of philosophy. Philosophy wasn't to tell you comforting lies, but it was to challenge you into discomfort. In Western philosophy, Socrates narrowed its scope into one single truth, which is the basis of modern science today, searching for the ultimate theory that explains everything. Quote, "There's only one good knowledge, one evil, ignorance. This single truth became the cornerstone of Western philosophy for almost 2,500 years, until the German Nietzsche questioned it, paving the way for postmodernism that believed in multiple truths. Socrates didn't leave any written records because he was busy on the streets challenging strangers about their truths. I wonder if he was around today, how he would challenge people about my truth, your truth. First, people would think he's crazy. Second, he would go mad with everyone having their own truths. Plato. After the death of Socrates, the torch was passed on to one of his students who also wrote his teacher's philosophical ideas down. Plato, who lived between 427 and 347 BCE, having witnessed his teacher executed by the democratic mobs, was an idealist, arguing that we all have a perfect idea of something, but in reality this does not exist. It only exists in our mind as a perfect form of that thing. There are chairs we see inside a room, but those are just models of a perfect chair that only exists in our mind. In other words, the chairs that humans make are modeled on a perfect chair inside the human mind. We see a mere shadow of what reality is on the outside. His famous thought experiment, Allegory of the Cave, illustrates that if you face away from the light source and see your own shadow inside a cave, that's how we perceive reality. Not what it is, but its shadow through our senses. So for Plato, humans can pre-assemble with all knowledge. In other words, we don't learn through our experiences or senses, but it's all inside. It only comes out when we experience it. Quote, what we call learning is only a process of recollection. This makes Plato's philosophy somewhat counterintuitive. We think what's on the outside is the real thing, and what we have on the inside in our mind is a mere representation of that real object. Plato thinks the opposite. What we see on the outside is the shadow of what's in our mind. We have an innate knowledge of the world from birth, and what we learn is just remembering or recalling those things that are already stored inside us. This is very similar to how the rationalists saw knowledge, which I'll discuss later on. Plato's idea of knowledge coming from inside us can also be interpreted in terms of the subconscious, or Jungian collective subconscious, deeply embedded in us from our evolutionary past. For instance, the fear of a snake in us is not because we experience snake bites in our own life, but because our ancestors experienced it in savanna, in the trees, or jungle, or in the cave. Despite us living in beautiful, safe houses, we still have the inner experience of being in the dark cave. Another example is horror movies. Our desire to see horror movies is simply because we still want to experience the fear from time to time, because that fear is inside us, and horror movies simply stimulate that fear. Sigmund Freud's dream interpretation is another way to understand Plato. In other words, dreams are our little window into the subconscious world inside us. Fiction writers, artists, musicians often experience a trance-like state when they are immersed in their art, tapping into their subconscious to bring out an art that is appreciated by many people simply because they reach a deeper well inside to drink from the collective subconscious knowledge. Despite being the artistic uncle, Plato also had strong opinions about politics. Plato was a republican and saw democracy akin to a mob rule as it killed his teacher Socrates. So he argued that philosophers were better suited to rule society as a republic. Just like Nietzsche, he had a low opinion of general public as unsuitable to rule a society, while philosophers were better equipped to rule a society. So he set up his academy where he wanted to cultivate the best minds of a generation, the elites of society. Today's university is very much modeled on Plato's academy where the intellectuals lock horns to discuss ideas. And one of those people was Aristotle, who graduated from his academy. Plato is called the idealist philosopher. However, his student Aristotle went a different route towards practical knowledge. So to sum up, Plato's teacher, Mr. Socrates, questioned things to find the truth. Plato said truth or perfection only exists in the soul, in the mind, or in the world of ideas or forms, and only their shadows are perceived through our senses. So Socrates gave philosophy a method of finding the truth, while Plato offered a perfectionist vision of the truth inside the mind. Now these two come together in Aristotle to provide a basis for modern Western philosophy, a progressive, perfectionist vision of truth-seeking, a single truth. Aristotle. While Plato sat inside a cave saying that to find the truth, reasoning was superior to real-world observation, his student Aristotle, however, reversed this by getting his hands dirty and dissecting the frogs and gazing at stars to understand the real world. Aristotle, who lived between 384 and 322 BCE, argued that truth is not inside us, but it's on the outside in the real world. Truth, in other words, is in the world around us. His method was evidence-based research, akin to modern science. He actually went to the fields to study animals and sea creatures. He questions Plato's ideal form, saying that if a man is the model of an ideal form, who is the ideal form model of? It's the same argument. If God created us, who created God, and who created the God that created God, which goes to infinity. Aristotle put human senses to work and argued that our observation of things is the best way to find the truth. He said everything in the world can be categorized by their substance, quantity, place, time, and so forth. Today, modern science classifies animals into species, earth into continents and oceans, rocks, and minerals. This categorization helps humans to gain knowledge much faster and more effectively. He famously said humans are rational animals. Aristotle also said that everything has a purpose or a telos, or an end goal. The purpose of this video is to educate people about philosophy. As a result, Aristotle's telos has become a branch of philosophy called teleology that looks at things through their purpose, not their essence. So when we look at a chair, we don't think of the wood and trees and forests, but we think of sitting on it. A chair is to be sat on, not considered a piece of tree. So Aristotle's telos put purpose before essence. As a result, Western philosophy is a very purpose-driven way of thinking, which emphasizes something's utility or use before its essence. As a result, Western cultures value solution to problems, efficiency, and pragmatism that make things better. Today, modern science develops useful technology, so it's heavily utility-based. We like useful things. The purpose of science is to develop technology to make life easier. What is the purpose of human civilization? To reach perfection, which is a kind of Aristotelian teleology. So Aristotle's telos coincided with the Christian view that we are heading towards an apocalypse or heaven, a perfectionist utopia where you're happy and blissful. In science, we're heading towards a perfect understanding of the universe and life. So telos allows us to make plans, have goals, and strive towards something. Without an end goal, it is hard to motivate ourselves to do things. Just like Plato, he also set up a school called Lyceum, where he gathered all the best minds of his generations to study. One of his most famous students prior to the Lyceum was a man who took his teleological teaching to conquer the world. It was, of course, Alexander the Great, who made it all the way to India in his attempt to conquer the world. I should point out an important Greek philosopher who lived outside the rationality-dominated school. It was Epicurus, whose philosophy centered on happiness, not rationality or truth. So instead of an academy or school, he set up a hippie-style garden where he gathered his friends to talk philosophy while enjoying life in peace and tranquility. Epicurus understood that the biggest enemy of happiness is also the main reason humans invented philosophy. What is it? The fear of death. The entire foundation of human philosophy rests on this mystery. Epicurus had a very clever answer. He said the fear of death is irrational. It makes no sense. Why? For the simple reason that we do not know death. Not only that, we cannot know death, because nobody has returned from death to tell us what it is. Death is just one-way street. Now that we know the fact that we do not and cannot know death, why fear it? We're afraid of lions because we know they can eat us. We're afraid of fire because we know the pain. But we cannot and will not know death. It's totally irrational to be afraid of it. Instead of worrying about death, we should make the most of this life by living in and spreading peace and happiness among others. Later, his philosophy was adapted into utilitarianism to maximize happiness for the majority of people. But despite his philosophy of happiness, Epicurus remains an outsider in Western philosophy. So to sum up, Socrates questioned people on the streets of Athens to critically examine things in life. Plato sat inside a cave, not literally though, and asked himself about the ideal form that may have come from God or the human mind, while Aristotle went to the field and got his hands dirty to understand the natural world. Socrates placed virtue in knowledge and rational truth, while rejecting passion, emotions, or faith as dogmatic. This was Nietzsche's biggest problem with Western philosophy, which he squarely blamed on Socrates. Too much rationality ignores human passion and heavily relies on reason, which is rigid, inflexible, that turns us into machines. Plato, however, retreated to himself and argued that perfection doesn't exist on the outside, but only on the inside, in our head. The world is a terrible place precisely because it's a skewed model of a perfect form that only exists in our mind. Plato's ideas were closer to the religious idea of God, so later Christians and Muslims interpreted Plato's perfect form as God. God is perfect, while humans in the world are imperfect images of God. Aristotle said, forget about the imperfect world. Someone has to go to the field to study the bloody nature through observations and dissections. So his method was empirical science, which became the basis of medieval Islamic science and later 16th century European science. Next, I'll talk about the three horses of Eastern philosophy, the Buddha, Lao Tzu, and Confucius.